A decorated Navy SEAL who walked away from every medal, every headline, every chance at recognition, choosing instead to raise his daughter alone and protect strangers from the shadows. A ruthless CEO who saw only a number on a spreadsheet when she looked at him. One night, a runaway truck, a rainstorm, and 3 seconds changed everything. She never saw his face clearly. He never asked her to. But the truth about who Landon Pierce really was? That was about to tear through her world like a blade through silk. If this story already has you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see how far this reaches. Now let's get into it. The termination notice was printed on company letterhead, clean white paper with the Kensington Group logo embossed at the top in silver and navy blue. It sat on the edge of Landon Pierce's workbench for 45 seconds before he picked it up. He read it twice. Not because he didn't understand it the first time. He understood it perfectly. Had half expected something like this for the past 3 weeks, ever since the new CEO started making her rounds through the building with a clipboard and that particular expression people wore when they'd already made up their minds and were just collecting justification. He read it twice because he wanted to make sure his hands stayed steady while he did. They did. He folded the paper along its original crease, slid it into the chest pocket of his gray work shirt, and turned back to the HVAC unit he'd been servicing on the building's 14th floor mechanical room. The secondary coolant line on Unit 7 had been showing irregular pressure readings for 6 days. He'd flagged it twice in the maintenance log. Nobody upstairs had responded. He finished tightening the coupling joint, replaced the access panel, and logged the completed repair on his tablet. Then he clocked out. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in early November, and Landon Pierce walked out of the Kensington Group's corporate headquarters for the last time, carrying a canvas tool bag, a thermos, and a small framed photograph of his daughter that had lived on his workbench for 4 years. He took the stairs. The Kensington Group occupied a 40-story glass tower in the financial district of a city that had long since learned to mistake speed for progress. It was the kind of building that looked impressive from the street and felt slightly hostile from the inside. All polished granite lobbies and conference rooms with names like Innovation Suite and Vision Hub that nobody used without a trace of embarrassment. The company had started as a mid-sized industrial conglomerate, then pivoted into diversified holdings across logistics, commercial real estate, and workforce solutions. 3 years ago, when the board had passed over every senior candidate and installed Isla Kensington as CEO at 27 years old, the business press had called it either a bold generational gamble or a catastrophic mistake, depending on which outlet you read. Isla had spent the 2 years since then making the kind of moves that kept people guessing. She'd restructured 3 divisions, replaced half the C-suite, taken the company's stock price from $42 to $68, and acquired 2 regional competitors at terms that made her CFO visibly nervous. She was sharp, and she was fast, and she worked with the focused energy of someone who felt perpetually behind, even when she was winning. Her assistant Priya once overheard her say, during a late Tuesday phone call, that she didn't actually enjoy any of it, that it was more like a problem she needed to solve before it solved her. Priya hadn't repeated that to anyone. The workforce reduction initiative had been her idea. Not the cuts themselves, those had been brewing in the operational review for months. But the scale and the speed, 12% reduction across non-revenue generating support functions. Facilities, maintenance, administrative services. The people, as she'd put it in the executive meeting, who don't move the needle. She hadn't been cruel when she said it. She'd been clinical. There was a difference, though the people on the wrong end of that distinction rarely felt it. Landon Pierce had appeared on the reduction list as Employee ID 4471, Maintenance Technician Grade 3, Annual Compensation $67,400, tenure 8 years and 3 months. He'd been flagged as above pay grade ceiling for role due to a series of raises he'd quietly accumulated over the years, mostly off-cycle adjustments pushed through by facilities managers who'd seen enough of his work to know they were underpaying him, but couldn't officially promote him because he'd never applied for anything higher. The algorithm marked him as inefficient use of headcount. Isla had reviewed the list on a Thursday morning, approved it, and moved on to the next agenda item. She had never met him. Landon's daughter was named Rosie. She was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown that turned amber in bright light, and her father's stubborn chin and her own very specific opinions about what constituted an acceptable dinner. She was doing homework at the kitchen table when Landon got home, feet tucked under her on the chair, pencil moving with the concentrated aggression of a child who found second-grade mathematics personally offensive. "Dad," she said without looking up, "what's 8 times 7? 56. That's too big." "It's not too big, it's just right." She erased something with significant force. "Can we have pasta tonight?" "We had pasta Monday." "Monday was a long time ago." Landon set his bag down by the door and his thermos on the counter and stood there for a moment looking at her. The way the kitchen light caught the edge of her hair, the small furrow between her brows that looked exactly like a furrow he'd seen in mirrors for 37 years. The photograph from his workbench was still in his hand. He set it on the counter next to the thermos. "Pasta's fine," he said. He didn't tell her that night. She was 7. She didn't need to be carrying his problems around. He made the pasta, helped her finish the math worksheet, read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through together, and sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing settled into sleep. Then he went to the kitchen table and opened his laptop and pulled up his bank balance and his recurring expenses and his calendar, and he looked at all 3 for a while without writing anything down, because the numbers were already arranged in his head and none of the arrangements were comfortable. He had savings. Not extravagant savings, but 8 years of careful living had built a cushion that most people in his position didn't have. He figured he had about 4 months before he'd need to start making harder decisions. He could find work. He had skills that employers tended to value once they actually understood them, which was the part that was harder to predict. Explaining, without a resume that looked conventional, why a 43-point maintenance inspection record was evidence of someone worth hiring. He'd been through this before. He knew how to make it work. It just took longer than it should. He closed the laptop and washed the pasta pot and went to bed. He didn't sleep. That wasn't new. Sleep had always been a negotiation for Landon. Some nights it came reasonably, other nights it sat just out of reach while his mind ran its quiet circuits. He'd gotten better at it over the years, better than the early years after Claire had died, when not sleeping had felt like the only honest response to the world. Now it was mostly manageable. He just lay there in the dark and let his mind do what it needed to do, which tonight involved going over every maintenance job he'd left pending at the Kensington building and cataloging who knew about them and whether anyone would actually follow through. Unit 7's coolant coupling, which he'd fixed today. The load-bearing wear on elevator cable B and shaft 4, which he'd flagged 3 weeks ago and received no response on. The corroded conduit junction on the 22nd floor east wing that had been a code violation for 6 months. The backup generator test that was overdue by 11 days. He thought about these things the way another man might think about whether he'd locked the front door, a low, persistent awareness that wouldn't fully let go until he knew they were handled. They weren't his responsibility anymore. He understood that. He was no longer an employee of the Kensington Group, and whatever happened in that building from this point forward was someone else's problem. He understood that completely, and it didn't help at all. The storm came in fast the following night, the way November storms sometimes did in that city. A front pushing down from the north that meteorologists had tracked for 2 days and still managed to underestimate. By 7 p.m., the rain was coming down hard enough to make the streets look like rivers, and the wind was the kind that made traffic signals swing, and pedestrians lean forward at strange angles, and drivers gripped their steering wheels a little tighter than usual. Landon was out in it because Rosie had a Thursday evening art class at a community center 12 blocks from their apartment, and he always walked her there and walked her back regardless of weather because she was 7 and because the route crossed one intersection he didn't entirely trust. He dropped her at the door, confirmed pickup time with the instructor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Okafor, who smelled like turpentine and was genuinely excellent with children, and then headed back out to wait at the coffee shop on the corner rather than stand in the community center lobby being accidentally awkward at the other parents. He was on his second block when the situation ahead of him registered. The lights at the intersection of Garrison and 5th were out. Power fluctuation from the storm or a blown transformer somewhere upstream. Traffic was moving on confusion and instinct, which is a dangerous combination under normal circumstances and a catastrophic one in heavy rain at night. A city bus had stopped half blocking the crosswalk, its hazard lights flashing amber. Several cars were threading around it. Pedestrians were crossing in mixed patterns, umbrellas making it hard to see faces, rain making it hard to see anything. And then there was the truck. It was a commercial delivery vehicle, the kind that weighed upward of 15 tons loaded. And from the way it was moving, something was wrong. It had come through the intersection from the north on what should have been a red and was now accelerating rather than correcting, its rear end starting to swing wide in a way that meant either brake failure or driver incapacitation, and it was aimed at the far corner of the intersection where a silver sedan had stopped and where a woman in a dark coat had just stepped off the curb. Landon was already moving before he'd made a decision about it. Later, thinking back, he couldn't clearly account for the specifics of what he did. Not in a traumatic way. His memory was fine. It was just that certain kinds of physical action had, over years of training and application, stopped being a series of conscious choices and had become more like weather, something that happened through him rather than by him. He crossed 40 feet of sidewalk and street in the kind of time that later surprised him when he estimated it. He saw the geometry of the truck's trajectory and the woman's position and the sedan between them, and he processed the calculation without narrating it, the way a person doesn't narrate breathing. He hit the woman from behind and to her left, one arm crossing her torso and one hand finding the sedan's hood for bracing leverage, and he moved her out of the truck's path with enough force that they both went down hard on the wet pavement on the far side of the vehicle. The truck's rear corner caught the sedan's driver's side door with a sound like a building falling, crumpling steel, shattering glass. The long, shrieking grind of metal dragged across asphalt as the truck finally found a building facade to stop against 40 feet past the intersection. Then it was just the rain. Isla Kensington's first conscious impression was that she was wet, which seemed wrong, and that something was wrong with her shoulder, which definitely was wrong, and that there was a man's arm around her. She came up through whatever shock had briefly blanked her with a sharp intake of breath that was almost a gasp and almost a word, and ended up being neither. "Don't try to stand yet," said a voice above her. Calm. Not the kind of calm that was pretending. The kind that had nowhere else to be. She was on her hands and knees on wet pavement. The rain was hitting her head and the back of her coat, and there was broken glass somewhere nearby, and her left shoulder hurt in a specific way that suggested she'd hit it on something during whatever had just happened. She turned her head and saw the sedan she'd been standing next to. The driver's side door was simply gone, replaced by a cave-in of crumpled metal, and there was a delivery truck sitting against a building 40 feet away with its hood crumpled and its hazard lights still working. "The truck," she said. "It stopped. Driver looks okay. He's moving." The voice was still level. "You've got something on your forehead. It might just be rain. Can you tell me if your vision's clear?" She touched her forehead, and her fingers came away with something dark. Her vision was fine. Her heart was not. She turned to look at who was talking. He was crouching beside her, a man in a gray work shirt that was now soaked through, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, broad through the shoulders. A face that wasn't young exactly, but wasn't old either. The kind of face that had been through enough weather that weather didn't particularly affect its expression. He was already looking past her at the truck, scanning the intersection, then back to her. Not nervous, just attentive. "I'm a doctor," said someone coming through the gathering crowd. "Let me through." The man beside Isla didn't need to be told twice. He moved back smoothly, creating space, and Isla watched him do it with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives after a shock has cleared, noticing things with unusual sharpness. The way he moved, the complete absence of anything performative in it. "Who are you?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the look she couldn't quite read. Not unfriendly, not particularly warm, just there, present. "You should let the doctor check you over," he said. "That cut might need a stitch." And then the crowd shifted. Someone was kneeling beside her with a medical bag. Someone else was on a phone. The lights of emergency vehicles were already reflecting off the wet street from 2 blocks away. And when Isla looked up again from the hands checking her forehead, the man in the gray shirt was gone. She had a mild concussion, a cut above her left eyebrow that took 3 stitches, a bruised shoulder, and a scrape on her left palm that was more impressive looking than serious. She also had a significant case of something she privately refused to call shock, because she had never identified as the kind of person who went into shock, and she wasn't about to start. The ER doctor was professionally unconcerned in the way that ER doctors became after years of seeing things that actually required concern, and he told her she was lucky, which she knew, and that she should follow up with her regular physician, which she wouldn't, and that someone would need to drive her home. Priya arrived 20 minutes after Isla's text, still in work clothes, bringing a dry coat and the specific expression of someone who was personally affronted by the inconvenience to their employer. She sat beside Isla in the small curtained bay while a nurse did the discharge paperwork and said very carefully, "Do you want me to find out who the man was?" "What man?" "The one who pulled you out of the way." Priya had her tablet. She was already doing something on it. The police took statements. 2 witnesses mentioned a man in a gray work shirt. One of them got a partial on his face. Isla looked at the ceiling for a moment. Her shoulder ached. The cut above her eye had started to itch where the local anesthetic was wearing off, which the doctor had told her would happen and which was still annoying. "I don't know what he looked like," she said. "I know. That's why we'll need the witnesses." She turned her head to look at Priya. "I didn't say I wanted to find him." "You didn't say you didn't." Isla closed her eyes. Outside the curtained bay, the ER was doing what ERs did. Steady noise, movement, the background frequency of a place organized around urgency. She'd been in buildings her whole career that were organized around urgency, and she'd always found it clarifying. Right now it wasn't clarifying anything. The man in the gray shirt, the arm around her, the voice, "Don't try to stand yet." The absolute steadiness of it, while her hands were shaking. "Not tonight," she said. Priya made a note. "Okay." The police report was filed the following morning, and it covered the truck incident. Brake line failure, driver uninjured, 1 vehicle totaled, 2 pedestrians treated and released. The responding officers had collected witness statements and reviewed traffic camera footage from the adjacent block, which had captured enough of the scene to confirm what witnesses had described. An unidentified male had moved a female pedestrian from the vehicle's path approximately 1.2 seconds before impact. The male had not remained at the scene. He had not identified himself to any officer. He was not required to, and no charges were pending, and the police file would note the incident as a fortunate outcome and move on. Isla read the report at 6 a.m. at her kitchen counter with coffee she'd barely touched, and then she opened her laptop and did something she hadn't planned to do the night before, but found herself doing anyway. She pulled up the Kensington Group's internal HR records. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. Something about the gray shirt. A uniform, she'd thought in the intersection, but hadn't processed until now. And something about the way he'd moved through the crowd, the way he'd created space for the doctor, with the particular ease of someone who understood space as a tactical resource rather than a social consideration. She had no actual basis for what she was about to do. She did it anyway. She ran a search. Terminated employees, facilities, and maintenance past 30 days. 14 names came back. She skimmed them. 3 were women. Of the remaining 11, she was looking for something she couldn't fully articulate. Some instinct about the man she'd seen for approximately 90 seconds in a rainstorm by bad light. She almost closed the window. Then one entry stopped her. Pierce Landon. Employee ID 4471. Maintenance technician grade 3. Tenure 8 years, 3 months. Terminated November 7th. November 7th was yesterday, the day of the storm. She stared at that for a long moment. It was probably nothing. 14 people on that list, 12% reduction across an entire division. Any one of them could theoretically have been in that intersection for any reason. She had no actual grounds to connect this name to the man she'd seen. She clicked through to his employee file anyway. The photograph was standard corporate ID issue, the slightly flat quality of a fluorescent lit hallway. A person looking at a camera with the expression of someone who considered photo IDs a low priority. He was maybe mid to late 30s, dark hair, a face that, in better light, she thought she might recognize. She kept reading. Most of the file was routine, pay history, attendance record, facilities assignments, but in the archived section, the section that automated reports didn't pull from, that you had to open manually, there were notes. Manager notes, going back 7 years. She started reading them and stopped after the third one because the third one said, In the matter-of-fact language of a facilities supervisor writing for an internal log, LP identified hairline fracture in structural support, beam B12 during routine inspection, flagged for structural engineering review. If unaddressed, estimated risk to building integrity, significant. Building engineer confirmed finding. Repair cost, $340,000. Estimated cost of failure, catastrophic. She sat back. Then she kept reading. The stack of service records took her the better part of 2 hours. She read them with the same attention she gave to acquisition due diligence, which was the kind of attention that most people found excessive, and which was what she was actually good at. What emerged from the records over 8 years and 3 months was not what she'd expected to find, and not what she would have predicted from an employee who had, on paper, been nothing more than a maintenance technician. 2 potential electrical fires identified and suppressed before detection. 1 gas line irregularity that, per the third-party inspection report attached to the file, had been within hours of reaching a threshold that would have required building evacuation. 4 infrastructure failures caught at early stage, HVAC, electrical, structural, plumbing, where the documented cost of late detection would have ranged from several $100,000 to potentially millions of dollars. And then, buried in a set of security logs from 3 years ago that had been filed under routine incident reports, a notation from the overnight security supervisor. Maintenance tech, Pierce L. Identified and detained individual in sub-basement level attempting unauthorized access to server room. Individual found to be former contract employee attempting data theft, turned over to corporate security. No further incident. There had been no press release about that. No commendation in this public file. Just a security supervisor's notation, and a week later, a small off-cycle pay adjustment of $1,200 that someone had pushed through for Pierce, and that looked, in context, like the most inadequate thank you she'd ever seen. Isla sat in her kitchen with cold coffee and a throbbing cut above her eye, and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in the context of business decisions. She felt like she'd made a serious mistake. But it took her 4 days to find out where he lived, which felt both faster and slower than it should have. Faster because she had access to HR records that included an address. Slower because she spent 2 of those 4 days telling herself she was going to handle this with a phone call, and then not making the phone call, which was not characteristic of her, and she knew it. On the 5th day after the incident, she drove to the address herself. It was a neighborhood in the middle of the city, not the affluent part she lived in, not the struggling part the local news covered, just the functional middle that most of the city actually was. 3-story walk-ups and corner stores and a park with a cracked basketball court that someone had strung new nets on. His building had a buzzer system and a front door that didn't quite close all the way. She buzzed the apartment number from the file and waited. Nothing for 30 seconds. Then, yeah. His voice, which she recognized from the rain. "Mr. Pierce," she said to the intercom. "My name is Isla Kensington. I know who you are." Silence. She waited. She'd been in enough negotiations to know not to fill silence when the silence wasn't hers to fill. "I'm going to say something," she said, "and I'd rather say it in person than through an intercom. But if you prefer I leave, I'll leave." Another pause. Then the door buzzed. Oh. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and he was standing in the open doorway when she reached the landing. Work clothes, though not the gray shirt from the intersection. His arms were crossed, not aggressively, just as a default posture. He was taller than she'd registered in the rain. From inside the apartment, she could hear a child's voice, something about a crayon color. "She's working on a project," he said, by way of explanation or warning. "So this shouldn't take long." Isla had prepared for this. She'd thought through what she wanted to say, had practiced the various ways it could go, had anticipated resistance and had responses ready. She was good at this. Preparation was something she trusted. Standing in the hallway, looking at him, she forgot all of it. "I owe you an apology," she said. 2 of them, actually. He watched her with an expression that wasn't cold, but wasn't open either. The expression of someone who'd learned to wait and see before deciding what a thing was. "The company terminated you," she said. "I approved that. I didn't know who you were, and I should have, not specifically you, but I should have understood what I was deciding. And 5 days ago, you saved my life, and you didn't stay, and you didn't. She stopped, started again. I've been reading your service records for the last 4 days, and I don't know how to. You don't have to. I'm aware I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something. I'm not looking for anything, he said. From you or the company, if that's why you came. I know. She held his gaze. I came because I needed to say it to your face, because you deserve that much at minimum. From inside the apartment. Dad? Who is it? He glanced back over his shoulder. Someone from work, Rosie. Give me a minute. From work. Past tense. Present tense. She wasn't sure which way he'd meant it. I'd like to talk to you, Isla said. Not today, and not about a job, necessarily, just to understand what you did here, what you were doing in that building for 8 years. She paused. If that's something you'd consider. He looked at her for a long moment. The hallway was narrow and slightly too warm and smelled like someone had cooked something with garlic recently, which was a very ordinary smell for an extraordinary moment. Thursday, he said. There's a diner on Calloway, noon. Okay. I'll be there for an hour. I have to pick Rosie up from school at 2. Okay, she said again. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant the conversation was concluded and also that he wasn't unkind, and stepped back toward his door. Isla turned and walked back down the stairs. She didn't look back, partly because she'd been raised not to, and partly because she was already thinking about Thursday and what she was actually hoping to learn, and partly because she thought, if she looked back, she might find she'd changed the terms of something without meaning to. Outside, the street was ordinary. November cold, gray sky, 2 kids on bikes going somewhere with the focused urgency of children who always have somewhere to be. She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine. 8 years. All those fires he'd caught before they caught. All those things he'd fixed before they broke. All those moments where he'd been the difference between something terrible happening and something terrible not happening. And nobody had known. And he'd known nobody wouldn't know. And he'd done it anyway. She started the car. Above her left eye, the cut was still healing. 3 stitches. A small scar that would probably fade in a few months, or might not. The doctor hadn't been certain. She thought, in an odd way she couldn't have explained to anyone, that she hoped it didn't fade entirely, that she wanted to keep the small remainder of that night on her face. Landon Pierce had never asked to be seen, but she was going to see him now. She owed him at least that. The diner on Calloway was the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to be anything other than what it was. Vinyl booths patched with electrical tape, a laminated menu that hadn't changed in years except for the prices, and even those changed reluctantly. The coffee came in thick ceramic mugs that had been through enough dishwasher cycles to lose whatever finish they'd originally had, and it was genuinely good coffee, which was the kind of detail that separated the places worth returning to from the places that merely survived. Landon was already there when Isla arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall and a mug in front of him and a clear sightline to the door. She noticed that the sightline, the way she was noticing things about him now that she would have walked past 3 weeks ago without registering. He watched her come through the door without any particular change in expression. Not unfriendly, just waiting. She slid into the opposite side of the booth, and the waitress appeared within 30 seconds, which suggested either excellent attentiveness or the particular radar that good diner staff developed for new arrivals. Coffee? The waitress asked. Please, Isla said. The waitress poured and left, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The diner had maybe 12 other customers, a low background of conversation, a radio somewhere playing something with a steel guitar. It was a Thursday in November, and the light through the windows was the thin, flat kind that made everything look slightly more honest than it wanted to be. You look better, Landon said. He nodded toward her forehead. The stitches were out. The cut had closed to a thin pink line. 3 stitches, she said. I'll survive. I know. She'd planned to start differently, to ease into what she wanted to know, to establish a rapport first. She looked at him across the table and understood that approach wasn't going to work. He wasn't a hostile witness, but he wasn't the kind of person who needed the social scaffolding either. He'd sit there indefinitely and say nothing until she got to the point. It was actually easier than she'd expected. "I spent 4 days reading your file," she said. "The full file, not the summary that came up in the reduction review." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Okay, I want to understand something. 8 years, 2 potential electrical fires, a structural finding that would have been catastrophic, a gas leak, a security breach, and none of it was ever formally recognized. None of it was ever communicated up the chain in any way that would have..." She stopped. "Did you ask for that? To be kept out of it?" He considered the question, or maybe he was just deciding how much of the answer he was willing to give. "The first time," he said, "the facilities supervisor offered to write it up formally. I told him not to bother. He looked relieved, honestly. Nobody wants the paperwork." "And after that?" "After that, it was just how things worked." He shrugged. "A minimal thing. I did the job. The job got done. Making a production of it wasn't why I was doing it." "Why were you doing it?" He looked at her steadily. "Because the building had 300 people in it." She let that sit. Outside, a city bus went past, its bulk momentarily blocking the thin November light, and the diner went briefly darker. "Tell me about the elevator," she said. The elevator situation had started 14 months ago, not with any dramatic warning sign, but with something almost too small to notice, a vibration pattern on cable B and shaft 4 that was 0.08 of a millimeter off from its normal oscillation. The kind of variance that the standard monthly inspection checklist didn't flag, because the standard monthly inspection checklist had been written by someone who understood elevators academically rather than mechanically, and the difference between those two things was not academic. Landon had noticed it because he rode the freight elevator in shaft 4 twice a day for years, and had developed, without consciously deciding to develop it, a physical memory of how it moved. When something changed, his body registered it before his mind named it, the way a person who's lived in a house for years wakes up from a dead sleep when a pipe starts making a new sound. He'd pulled the maintenance logs, run his own inspection outside the standard schedule, and found what he found: microfracturing in the cable casing where it seated against the upper guide pulley. Not catastrophic yet. Moving toward catastrophic on a timeline, he estimated at 8 to 14 months without intervention. He'd filed a service request. Standard channel, maintenance ticket system, flagged as priority. The ticket had been reassigned to a third-party elevator contractor who had inspected the cable using the standard inspection protocol, which did not involve the specific measurement Landon had taken, and had marked the elevator as within acceptable parameters. The ticket was closed. Landon had then done something that was technically outside his job description. He'd written a direct memo to the facilities director, typed on his personal laptop, printed, and slid under the director's office door because the facilities director's email was aspirationally organized in a way that meant it absorbed things without responding to them. The memo had been acknowledged verbally, 2 weeks later, in a hallway. "Yeah, I'll look into it." Which was not the same as looking into it. He told Isla this at the diner in the flat, factual way of someone recounting a process rather than a grievance. She listened without interrupting. "So what did you do?" She said. "I went back to shaft 4. He paused. "On my own time. Evenings, mostly. Watched the cable over about a 6-week period. Measured it myself every 2 weeks. When the rate of fracturing reached a threshold I wasn't comfortable with, I bypassed the contractor and called the city's elevator inspection bureau directly." She stared at him. "You called the city?" "It took 3 weeks to get an inspector out, but they came, and they used my measurements, and they took the cable out of service." He picked up his coffee. "That elevator carried about 60 people a day." "When was this?" "About 8 months ago." 8 months ago, she had been running an acquisition in Phoenix and had never noticed an elevator being taken out of service in one of her own buildings. 8 months ago, the man sitting across from her had spent his personal evenings measuring cable fracture rates to protect 60 people from a failure that nobody else had taken seriously enough to prevent. "The facilities director," she said. "Is he still..." "He left the company. About 4 months ago. Different reasons." She didn't ask about the reasons. She was quiet for a moment, and the diner noise continued around them. The scrape of a chair, someone laughing near the window, the steel guitar song ending and something slower beginning. "I need to ask you something else," she said, "and it's not about the building." He waited. "Your file has a military service notation. It's brief, just that you served with the Navy. But the way you moved in that intersection," she shook her head. "I've seen people do things under stress. I've never seen anyone move like that." He set down the mug. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking who you were before the maintenance job." Bah. Landon was quiet for long enough that she thought he might decline. It wasn't an aggressive silence. He wasn't performing reluctance for effect. It was the silence of someone deciding whether the honest answer was something they were willing to give to this particular person in this particular place on a Thursday afternoon. "I was a Navy SEAL," he said. 12 years. 3 combat deployments. 2 years on a specialized unit I can't fully characterize. Tactical engineering was part of it. Infrastructure assessment, structural analysis under field conditions. Recognizing what was dangerous and what wasn't. How things failed and how to stop them from failing." He paused. "The civilian version of that is maintenance." "You went from special operations to building maintenance." "I went from special operations to being Rosie's father." He said it plainly, without defensiveness. "Those are different things. The maintenance job was just the thing that paid for the second one." Isla turned her coffee mug in both hands. "Your wife." Something in his face didn't change and changed completely, the way a still surface looks different when you understand what's underneath it. "Claire," he said, "she died 4 years after I got out. Cancer. The fast kind. From diagnosis to—" He stopped. "Rosie was 3. I'd already been out of the service for 4 years by then, but after Claire died, I needed a job that had set hours. Something I could predict. Something that would let me be home when Rosie needed me home." He looked at the table. "The maintenance thing. I'd kept up the certifications because it's useful knowledge. Applied for the Kensington position because it was close to our apartment and the benefits were reasonable. That was the whole calculation. And you stayed 8 years. I had a reason to be careful with things." A pause. "The building had people in it who had families too. That wasn't complicated to me." She thought about the language in the performance notes she'd read, the facilities managers who'd written about him with the careful enthusiasm of people trying to recommend someone for a promotion the system wasn't designed to give. Exceptional situational awareness, identifies problems before instrumentation does. Reliable in a way that is difficult to quantify. Difficult to quantify because the metrics they were measuring hadn't been built to capture what he actually was. "I made a decision based on a number," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. "Annual compensation cost-to-function ratio. You were a line item on an efficiency review." "I know." "That's not an apology. I already did that. I'm just—" She exhaled. "I'm trying to understand how I missed it." He looked at her with something that might have been patience and might have been something more complicated. "Most of what I was doing wasn't visible. It wasn't supposed to be visible. If it had been visible, that would have meant I'd missed something." He turned the mug once in his hands. "You can't cost-benefit analyze something you can't see." "I should have built systems that could see it." He didn't argue with that. Priya had done her own digging because Priya was constitutionally incapable of being given a partial picture and not filling it in. She'd called Isla the night before the diner meeting with the specific tone she used when she had information she thought was going to be significant. "I talked to 4 people from the facilities team," Priya had said. "People who worked alongside Pierce for years. Do you want to know what they told me?" "Tell me." "The first one. Marcus. He's been in building maintenance for 12 years. He said Pierce helped him replace the roof on his mother's house 2 years ago. After a storm, just showed up on a Saturday with materials and spent the weekend on it and wouldn't take money." Priya paused. The second one said he'd seen Pierce give his lunch to the overnight security guard every week for about 8 months when the guard was going through a divorce and clearly wasn't eating. Didn't make a thing of it, just brought extra food. Isla had listened without speaking. The third one told me about last February. There was a gas leak in the residential building 2 blocks from the office. Not a Kensington building, nothing to do with the company. Pierce was walking past, identified the smell, went inside, got 7 people out of the building, and called it in. He was an hour late to his shift. He reported it as a personal errand. He didn't tell anyone? He said he had a slow start and apologized for the hour. Priya's voice was carefully controlled. He could have been cited for tardiness. HR flagged it in his file as his only attendance irregularity in 8 years. The final person Priya had spoken to was a woman named Dolores, who'd been the Kensington Building's front desk receptionist for 11 years. Dolores had been part of the same reduction round as Landon, laid off 2 weeks earlier. Priya had found her through a mutual contact, and Dolores had been direct. She said, and I'm reading this from my notes, "That man was the reason I stayed at that job as long as I did. Not because he was friendly, exactly. He wasn't one of those people who was friendly. He was just present. When something needed doing, he did it. When something was wrong, he fixed it. I watched him work for 7 years, and I never once saw him do something for credit." Priya stopped, and then she said, "Tell your boss she fired the wrong person." Isla had hung up and sat in the silence of her apartment for a while before she'd been able to move. She told Landon some of this at the diner, not the Dolores part, but the others. The roof, the lunch, the gas leak. She watched his face as she described each one. He didn't look pleased. He didn't look embarrassed exactly either. He looked like a man being told something about himself that he considered accurate but not particularly relevant. "People help people," he said. "It's not complicated. For some people, it's very complicated. Then they've made it that way." She looked at him. "You know, when I first got the CEO position, a board member told me that the job was about knowing what to optimize. You find the inefficiencies and you cut them. You protect the margin and you grow the revenue and you keep the machine running." She paused. "He's been on 3 boards in 12 years and he's very successful." "Sure." And I believed him. Not entirely, but enough to operate on it. She turned her coffee mug again, the ceramic warm under her palms. "I've been thinking about that decision, your termination, since I read your file. Not just the mistake of it, but the framework that made it possible. The way I'd organized my thinking so that a person like you was invisible to it." Landon was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car alarm started somewhere and then stopped. The waitress came by, caught Isla's eye, refilled her coffee without asking. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Please." I knew the reduction was coming. 3 weeks before it happened, I could see it. The way people were moving through the building, the consultants on the executive floor, the way the facilities director suddenly stopped returning internal calls. He looked at her steadily. "I knew I was probably on the list. And you still fixed the elevator coupling." "I fixed it because it needed fixing." She understood intellectually that this was not a complicated position, that the logic of it was simple. A thing is wrong, you fix it, your employment status is irrelevant to the thing being wrong. She understood this. She also understood that she could not, with complete honesty, say that she would have done the same, not in that situation, not knowing the outcome. "What would you have done," she said slowly, "if you'd been offered a promotion? In those 8 years, if someone had actually pushed through the title and the raise and the recognition," he thought about it. "I would have taken the raise," he said. "Rosie's expensive." A pause. "I wouldn't have known what to do with the recognition." She laughed. It surprised her. A real laugh. The kind that came from somewhere it didn't bother to get permission from first. He watched it happen with an expression she couldn't quite catalog. Not quite a smile. Something that was in the neighborhood of warmth and hadn't fully committed yet. They talked for the better part of 2 hours. Not the 1 hour he'd allotted, and he didn't mention the adjustment, and neither did she. She learned things she hadn't found in any file. She learned that he'd grown up in a small town in Western Virginia where his father had run a hardware store and his grandfather had built houses, and the idea of fixing things with your hands had been as natural as breathing. That he'd enlisted at 19 because he'd been restless and because a recruiter had talked about the SEAL program with such specific honesty. It will be the hardest thing you ever do, and you will probably fail. That something in Landon had decided that was exactly what he needed. That he'd nearly failed 3 times in training and had finished anyway because stubbornness, as he put it, was the one quality the selection process could not actually measure out of you. She learned that Claire had been a high school art teacher, that they'd met when she was 24 and he was 26, and he'd been on leave and had walked into a coffee shop where she'd been grading papers, and that the nature of their meeting had been so ordinary that he'd told the story for years afterward, with a specific kind of wonder, as if ordinary was the most astonishing category. She learned that Rosie had her mother's talent for drawing and was currently working on an illustrated story about a dog who could fly, which was 14 pages long and had a plot that Landon described as ambitious, with an expression that communicated something much closer to the edge of love than the word ambitious usually implied. He wasn't a man who talked easily about himself. She could feel the effort in it, not performance, not calculation, just the genuine friction of a person who'd spent years practicing economy of disclosure. He gave her what she asked for, answered what she asked directly, offered nothing extra. But he listened to her too, which she hadn't entirely expected. When she talked about the company and the decision-making framework, and what she was starting to understand was broken in it, he didn't nod in the polite way people nodded when they were waiting to speak again. He actually listened. At one point she said, too honestly for the room, "I don't know if what I built is actually worth anything. The margins are good, the share price is good, but I look at what you were doing in that building for 8 years and I think, none of our efficiency metrics would have seen you coming. And I'm supposed to be the one who understands value." He looked at her without the reflexive reassurance she was used to people offering. "You're asking the right question," he said. "That's not nothing. It's not enough." "No," he agreed, "but it's where everything else starts." At 20 minutes to 2, he checked his watch and said he needed to go, and the statement had the uncomplicated finality of a man whose priorities were clearly ordered. She nodded. They split the check without discussion. She'd moved to pick up the full tab, and he'd already left cash on the table for half of it before she could finish the motion. She didn't argue. They stood on the sidewalk outside the diner. The November light was lower now, afternoon light moving toward the flat gold of early dusk, and it caught the side of his face and the gray that was starting at his temples that she hadn't noticed in the booth, or had noticed and hadn't registered. He had his jacket collar up against the cold. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "You drove to my building," he said. "Seemed like it mattered to you." "It did." He looked at her for a moment. Not long. The kind of look that was checking something, some internal measure she couldn't read the calibration of. "The elevator cable," he said. "B shaft, 14th floor. There's a secondary tension roller that I flagged in my last service report. I don't know if anyone picked it up. You should have someone check it." She blinked. Even now, It's a loose end," he said, as if this explained it completely. Because to him, it did. He nodded once, the same conclusive nod from the apartment hallway, and turned and walked up Calloway toward the school. She watched him go until he turned the corner. He didn't look back. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, then pulled out her phone and dialed Priya. "I need someone to inspect elevator B shaft, 14th floor," she said when Priya answered. "Tension roller, external inspector, not the contractor we've been using." "When?" "Today." She watched the corner where Landon had turned, now empty, just street. "And I need you to pull every flagged maintenance ticket in the last 3 years that was marked closed without independent verification." Priya was quiet for a second. "That's going to be a long list." "I know." She put the phone in her pocket and started toward her car. The city moved around her the way cities did, purposeful, indifferent, full of people with agendas, and nowhere near enough information about what was keeping them safe. She thought about the 300 people in her building and how many of them had ridden that elevator and never once thought about a cable. She thought about 8 years of service records. She thought about a man walking 12 blocks to pick up his daughter from school, who had spent the previous 2 hours answering her questions with the patience of someone who decided it was worth doing without requiring that she deserve it yet. The thin line of the healing cut above her eye itched slightly in the cold air. She left it alone. There was a lot she needed to fix. She was starting to understand the shape of how. The elevator inspector found the tension roller on the same day Isla made the call. It wasn't catastrophic yet. That was the word the inspector used. Yet, with the particular care of someone who understood that yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The secondary tension component on shaft B, 14th floor, had developed a stress fracture along its mounting bracket that the standard quarterly inspection would not have caught because the standard quarterly inspection did not include that component in its checklist. The fracture was consistent with the kind of progressive metal fatigue that developed over 18 to 24 months of regular load cycling. Left unaddressed for another 4 to 6 weeks, The inspector estimated a 30 to 40% probability of partial failure during peak usage hours. Peak usage hours meant between 8 and 9 in the morning and between 5 and 6 in the afternoon, when the elevator carried the most people. Priya delivered this information to Isla in a printed summary, which Isla read standing at her office window without sitting down. Then she asked Priya to close the door, and she stood there alone for a few minutes looking at the city below. The street grid, the tiny geometries of cars and people, the building across from hers with its lit windows and its own invisible infrastructure and its own unknown Landons doing unknown work in the walls where no one looked. "How many other tickets?" she asked when Priya came back. "Closed without independent verification, last 3 years?" "Yes." Priya set a second document on the desk. 47. Isla looked at the number. "Get me an external safety audit firm. Full building inspection. Every system. I want it started before the end of the month." "That's going to be, expensive." "I know. Schedule it." Word traveled the way word always traveled inside large organizations. Not through official channels, which were too slow, but through the network of people who talked to each other across departmental lines, because they'd been in the same building long enough to have built actual relationships. By the end of the week following the diner meeting, a version of the story was circulating among the remaining Kensington employees, that the maintenance technician who'd been let go in the reduction had been the one who'd saved the CEO's life in the storm, and that he'd also been the one responsible for about a dozen near disasters that nobody had known to be grateful for. The version that circulated was not entirely accurate in its details. Stories rarely were, but the emotional core of it, we didn't know what we had until it was gone, landed with particular weight in a building full of people who had recently watched colleagues get cut and had spent the intervening weeks wondering whether they were next. Isla heard about the circulating story from her head of communications, a careful man named Stefan, who specialized in delivering information in ways designed to manage her reaction. He described it as a narrative gaining traction internally and asked whether she wanted to get ahead of it. She told him she'd think about it, which was what she said when she needed him to leave the room. She didn't want to get ahead of it. She wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to do with it. The story was true, which complicated the usual communications calculus, and it was true in a way that reflected badly on decisions she'd made, which complicated it further. She'd spent 2 weeks now sitting with the discomfort of that, and it wasn't getting more comfortable. It was getting more specific, the way a bruise that starts as a general ache eventually locates itself precisely. She'd been wrong. Not just procedurally wrong, not just wrong in the particular case of Landon Pierce, but wrong in the framework. The reduction initiative had been built on a logic that treated human beings as variables in an optimization equation, and the logic had been clean and the equation had balanced, and it had still been wrong, and she hadn't seen it until a man she'd fired had pulled her out of the path of a truck without stopping to consider whether she deserved it. She was trying to figure out what you did with that kind of wrong, not the PR version of it, the actual version. Oh. It was Marcus from Building Maintenance who first took Isla to the community center on Delaney Street, though he didn't exactly intend to. She'd been doing what Priya had started calling her listening tour, which was Priya's diplomatic term for Isla showing up at coffee machines and in break rooms, and occasionally in stairwells to talk to employees she'd never spoken to before. It was awkward. Isla was self-aware enough to know it was awkward, that she was the person who'd signed the reduction order appearing in people's spaces asking how things were going, and that the initial response was the kind of careful, measured pleasantness that people produced when they weren't sure whether honesty had consequences. She pushed through the awkward because she didn't know another way to get the information she actually needed. Marcus was a 34-year-old maintenance technician who'd been with the company for 6 years and who, in Isla's assessment after 10 minutes of conversation, had the particular quality of someone who'd decided to say true things and accept whatever came of it. He told her straight out that morale in the facilities department was poor, that the 3 people remaining from the original team were doing the work of 6, and that 2 of the flagged items from the audit firm's preliminary review should have been caught months ago and weren't because the team was too thin. "We know it," he said. "Nobody's pretending. It's just—" He shrugged. "When you're the people who get cut first every time someone needs to show numbers, you stop expecting it to be different." She wanted to argue with that, and stopped herself because arguing with it wasn't what the moment needed. "Tell me about Landon Pierce," she said instead. Marcus looked at her with the measured expression of someone deciding how far to go. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you think I should know." He thought for a moment. Then, "You know the community center over on Delaney? The one that serves the North Side families?" "I've heard of it. Landon's been volunteering there for, I don't know, at least 4 years. I know because I ran into him there once when I was dropping off some donated stuff. He was fixing their boiler on a Saturday. He'd brought Rosie with him. She was doing homework at one of the tables while he worked." Marcus paused. "He does that. Takes her with him when he volunteers, so they still get the time together. She thinks it's normal." A small laugh. "She probably thinks everyone's dad spends Saturdays fixing boilers at community centers." "Does anyone at the center know his background? The military service?" "I don't think he tells people. He told me once, by accident almost. We were talking about load-bearing calculations and he said something about field assessments, and then kind of stopped. I asked him about it later and he gave me the short version. 12 years Navy, some of it classified." Marcus picked up his coffee. "He doesn't talk about it like it's impressive. He talks about it like it's old weather." She drove to the community center on Delaney Street that Saturday. The Delaney Community Center was a 2-story building that had been, at various points, a factory warehouse, a social services office, and a recreation facility before arriving at its current incarnation as a neighborhood resource hub. After-school tutoring, job placement assistance, a food pantry on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a small medical clinic staffed by volunteer practitioners 2 days a week. It operated on the kind of budget that required its staff to think creatively about the word operating, and it showed in the building's exterior, which was clean and functional and held together in ways that suggested regular attention from someone who cared more than the budget could cover. Isla found the director, a woman in her 50s named Greta Solis, in an office that was really just a large closet with a desk in it and stacks of binders that had exceeded the capacity of the shelves and colonized the floor. Greta had the manner of someone who'd been fielding requests, disappointments, and emergencies for long enough that she'd stopped treating any of them as unusual. And she looked at Isla, at her coat, which had cost more than Greta's monthly operational budget, with the particular wariness of someone who'd learned that people from certain zip codes brought certain kinds of help that came with strings she didn't have time to untangle. "I'm not here with a proposal," Isla said immediately. "I'm looking for someone. A man named Landon Pierce. I was told he volunteers here." Greta's expression changed. Not warmer, exactly. Just different. "Landon?" "Yes." "He's downstairs. Heating system." Greta paused, still reading Isla with the unhurried assessment of someone who was good at it. "How do you know him?" "He worked for my company." "Worked?" Greta repeated. The word came out flat and specific, the way words did when they were chosen to communicate more than their surface meaning. "It's complicated," Isla said. "I imagine it is." Greta leaned back in her chair. "He's been coming here for 4 years, every second and fourth Saturday, unless something's urgent, and then sometimes more than that. He fixed our roof last spring. Took him 3 weekends. Replaced the electrical panel the fall before that. He never invoices us, and when I try to give him anything, he gets uncomfortable." She paused. "He brought his daughter most times. She helped with the after-school kids sometimes. 7-year-old sitting with a 9-year-old helping him with reading. I don't know that she knew she was helping, she just thought she was hanging around." Isla stood in the small office and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite guilt anymore. Guilt had a quality of self-focus that this didn't have. This was something more like grief. For all the versions of the story she hadn't known, for all the ways value expressed itself in places that never made it into efficiency reviews. "Can I go down?" she asked. Greta looked at her for another moment. "Last door on the left past the kitchen." The basement of the Delaney Center was the kind of space that only existed in old buildings. Low ceiling, exposed pipes. The particular smell of concrete and dust and mechanical oil that meant decades of machinery in a contained space. The heating unit was a commercial boiler system that was older than it should have been and looked like something that had been repaired many times by many hands, and Landon was crouched beside the primary pump housing with a wrench and a work light, wearing the same kind of gray work shirt he'd worn the night of the storm. He heard her on the stairs, She could tell by the slight adjustment in his posture before he turned. Not surprise, just a recalibration. "Mrs. Solis called you," he said. "She didn't, actually." Isla came down the last 2 steps and stood on the concrete floor. "Marcus told me about this place. I came on my own." He looked at her for a moment, then back at the pump housing. He turned a bolt 3/4 of a rotation, checked it with his thumb, turned it another quarter. "Rosie's upstairs. There's a tutoring session." "I know. I saw her at the table." A pause. "She's very focused. She gets that from her mother." The boiler system made its low ongoing sounds, pressure, heat, the fundamental work of keeping a building warm. Somewhere above them, Isla could hear the distant movement of the center's afternoon activity. Children's voices. A chair sliding. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to give me an honest answer, even if you think it's not what I want to hear." He set down the wrench and picked up the work light, checking something inside the panel. "Ask. Did you know, when you were doing this, all of it, the building, here, all of it, did you ever want someone to know? Not for recognition, not for a promotion, just, did you ever get tired of being invisible?" The question sat in the basement air for a moment. He didn't answer right away. He closed the panel housing and clipped it shut, and then sat back against the wall with the work light in his hand, pointed at the floor so that it lit the space between them in a diffuse, sideways way. "Yeah," he said. She waited. "Not often, but yeah." He looked at the light rather than at her. "Mostly with Rosie. She'd ask me about work and I'd give her the version you give a 7-year-old, and sometimes she'd look at me like she knew there was more to it, but she couldn't figure out what, and I'd think about how I'd explain it when she was older, what I'd want her to understand." He paused. "That you don't do the right thing because someone's watching, but you're still human, and humans want to be seen. Those two things aren't contradictions." Isla sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. It was a deliberate decision. She was tired of standing over conversations she should have been sitting down for a long time ago. "The elevator cable," she said. "You reported it to the City Inspection Bureau because the internal channels failed. But you'd been at this company 8 years at that point, and you must have known that going outside the chain could have gotten you disciplined." "Could have?" "You did it anyway." 60 people, he said again, the same 2 words from the diner, with the same patient simplicity that wasn't simple at all. "I think," Isla said carefully, "that I have spent my entire career being smart in the wrong direction. I can look at a balance sheet and find the inefficiency in 30 seconds. I can model a 3-year acquisition scenario in my head while someone else is still reading the executive summary, and I walked past you for—" She stopped. She hadn't walked past him exactly. She'd never been in the same room as him before the night of the truck. That was its own indictment. "I constructed an organization where someone like you could be completely invisible to every metric I cared about. You're not the only one who builds things that way. That doesn't help me feel better about it. It's not supposed to." He said it without unkindness, "but it might help you build it differently." She came back to the community center the following Saturday, and the one after that. She told herself it was for the audit. She'd started a genuine operational review of what the center needed, which was real, and the facilities assessment she commissioned through the Kensington Group's pro bono services program was real. But she was not a person who lied well to herself for long, and she knew the other reason too. She came back because these Saturdays had become the only hours in her week when she learned things that mattered. She learned them mostly from the people who knew Landon, because Landon himself was careful about what he offered, and she'd stopped pushing past what he offered, understanding that the pushing was for her comfort and not for anything he owed her. She learned from a woman named Teresa, whose son had been in a car accident 18 months ago, and who'd found Landon at her door the following weekend with lumber and tools to build a wheelchair ramp that the city accessibility program had a 6-month backlog on. She hadn't asked him. Marcus had mentioned it in passing, and Landon had gone. Teresa said he'd finished the ramp in a day and a half and refused her attempt to give him money 4 separate times, and the last time she'd pushed, he'd said, "I'm going to leave now and you should keep that for something that actually costs money," and walked to his truck. She learned from a teenage boy named Darius who was 15 and had been doing the after-school program for 2 years, and who told her, with the kind of directness that teenagers achieved when they decided an adult was worth talking to. He's the first grown-up who explained something to me without making me feel stupid for not knowing it already. He'd been talking about Landon explaining how load-bearing structures worked, apparently, because Darius had an interest in engineering that nobody in his school had taken seriously yet. Landon had spent 3 Saturdays walking him through concepts, had given him a book, one of his own, Darius said, with notes in the margins in precise small handwriting, and had told him the names of 2 programs at the City Technical College he could apply for at 17. He doesn't talk like he's doing me a favor, Darius said. He talks like it's just obvious. Like, why wouldn't he explain it? She learned from Greta, finally, over bad coffee in the closet office, on the 3rd Saturday. He came here the first time about 4 weeks after his wife died. I didn't know any of that then. He showed up and said he'd heard we had facilities needs and that he had Saturdays free. He wasn't grieving in any visible way. He was just present. Greta turned her mug. I've run this center for 16 years. I know the people who come here because they need to feel useful, and the people who come because they're useful. Landon is the second kind. He doesn't need this. He just contributes it anyway. Did he ever tell you about the Navy? Isla asked. Not for almost 2 years. I found out by accident. One of our HVAC contractors came in to do an assessment and started talking to Landon about a pressure system, and it became clear pretty fast that Landon knew more about it than the contractor did, and eventually the contractor asked him outright where he'd learned it. Landon gave a short answer and moved on. Greta paused. I looked him up afterward, what I could find. She looked at Isla over her coffee. He has a commendation for extracting 7 people from a collapsed structure under active fire conditions. It's in the public record. He never mentioned it. 7 people from a collapsed structure. Isla thought of the 7 people at the residential gas leak in February, the ones he'd gotten out before calling it in and then reported as a personal errand. She thought about the long line of 7s, the quiet arithmetic of a man who kept pulling people out of things without counting them. He doesn't have a number for that, she said, partly to herself. Greta looked at her. What? He doesn't track it. He doesn't keep score. No, Greta agreed. He doesn't. The conversation that changed the shape of everything happened on a Tuesday, not a Saturday, and it wasn't at the community center. It happened at the small park near Landon's apartment, where Isla had asked to meet because she had something to say that felt too formal for a diner and too significant for a hallway. She got there first and sat on a bench and watched a group of pigeons investigate something near the fountain with the committed intensity of creatures who had made peace with low expectations. It was a cold Tuesday in December now, a month past the storm, and the park had the sparse, clean quality of a place between seasons, the last leaves down, the bare branches, the particular stillness that arrived when the year was finishing. Landon arrived exactly when he said he would and sat beside her on the bench with his hands in his jacket pockets and didn't ask why she'd wanted to meet here. He waited. She'd rehearsed this. She was aware of the irony of that. She was a person who'd made formal presentations to investment banks and regulatory bodies and hostile boards, and here she was rehearsing what to say to a man on a park bench in December. But the stakes felt different. Not professionally different, just different. I want to offer you a position, she said, not to apologize again, not to make myself feel better about what I did. A real position because I think you're the person for it, and I think the company needs it, and I've been talking myself out of asking you for 2 weeks because I've been worried you'd say no. He looked at her sideways. What's the position? I want to build a corporate safety and emergency preparedness function that doesn't exist yet. Not a compliance department. I have those. Something that actually does what you were doing informally for 8 years, but with authority and resources and without it being invisible. She paused. Chief Safety Advisor, direct report to me. You'd have budget, you'd have a team, and you'd have the ability to escalate anything to me directly without going through the chain. He was quiet for a moment, watching 2 pigeons negotiate a piece of something near the fountain. No executive title, she said. I know you won't want that. No corner office, no mandatory meetings. I'll work with you on the structure. But I need your eyes on that building, and I need your judgment in that function, and I can't find it anywhere else because I don't know how to hire for what you are. She paused. I've tried to write the job description 3 times. I keep coming back to someone who fixes things before they break and doesn't need anyone to watch. That's not a job description, he said. I know, but it's what I actually need. He looked at the fountain for a while. She did not fill the silence. Rosie's school is 4 blocks from your building, he said finally. I need to be able to leave at 2:15 on the days she has late pickup. She blinked. Yes, absolutely. And I want a maintenance team that's properly staffed. Not what it is now. 3 people doing the work of 6 is a liability. I'm already working on that. He looked at her. The community center on Delaney. They need a new roof next spring. I'll need to be able to keep my Saturdays. I won't touch your Saturdays. He nodded slowly. Not the conclusive nod she'd come to know, but something more tentative. Thinking. She watched him think and didn't rush it, which was not a quality she'd had in her before November, and was still something she had to consciously practice. I'm not good at organizations, he said. I'm not good at the politics of them. I'll tell you what I think is wrong even when it's inconvenient. I'll flag things that people don't want flagged. I don't do it to be difficult, and it's the job, she said. He looked at her, a sharp look, like she'd said something he hadn't expected. Yeah. That's exactly what I need it to be, she said. Someone who tells me what's wrong before it becomes a disaster, even when it's inconvenient, especially then. She held his gaze. I spent a month understanding what you were doing in that building, and the through line in all of it is that you told the truth about what you saw even when nobody wanted to hear it. I need that. The company needs it. And I don't know if you'll agree, but I think you've been doing the work of this job without the authority to actually do it properly. He looked away again. The park was quiet except for pigeons and distant traffic and the bare branch sound of December wind. I'd need to meet this team first, he said, before I commit. Of course. And I want to see the audit results. The full building assessment. I'll have them to you by end of week. He was quiet for another long moment. Then, Rosie asked me last week what I was going to do for work. I told her I was figuring it out. He paused. She said, You'll figure it out, Dad. You always fix things. She's 7. She doesn't know what that means, and she also completely means it. Isla didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. Tell me about the team structure, he said. And she did. They sat on the bench in the December cold while she laid out what she was thinking. The staffing plan, the budget, the reporting structure, the autonomy she was willing to build in. He asked questions that were specific and intelligent and occasionally cut to problems in her thinking that she had to stop and reconsider. The pigeons eventually found whatever they'd been looking for and moved on to a different part of the fountain. The afternoon light went flat, and then golden, and then started to fade. At 2:20, Landon stood up. I'll look at the audit results, he said, and I'll meet the team. She stood too. Okay. That's not a yes. I know. He looked at her. It's also not a no. She nodded. He put his hands back in his pockets and walked toward the park gate, and she watched him go with the awareness that she was in some incremental and unscheduled way becoming someone different than the person who'd approved a reduction list on a Thursday morning and moved on to the next agenda item. It was not comfortable. It was also not something she would have traded. The December sky was going purple-gray at the edges, the city lights beginning to matter. She sat back down on the bench, not because she had anywhere to be right at that moment, but because she needed a few minutes to sit inside the specific gravity of what she was trying to build, what she was trying to become. The park was almost empty. Across the street, the lights in the apartment buildings were coming on, floor by floor, family by family, all the invisible warm machinery of other people's lives doing its necessary work behind ordinary windows. She sat there until it was fully dark, and then she went home. The audit results arrived on a Friday morning in a document that was 63 pages long and color-coded by severity, and Isla read the whole thing before 9 a.m. with a cup of coffee that went completely cold on her desk. The external safety firm had been thorough in the way that outside eyes were always more thorough than inside ones. They had no institutional loyalty to the findings, no reason to soften a number or frame a risk in charitable language. What they produced was a precise and unsentimental account of a building that had been maintained with genuine skill for years and had begun deteriorating the moment that skill was removed. 31 items flagged across structural, mechanical, electrical, and fire suppression systems. 9 of them rated as requiring immediate attention. 4 of those 9 were directly traceable to work orders that Landon had filed and that had been closed without proper follow-through after his termination. The firm's cover letter, written by its lead inspector, a former OSHA regional director who had the prose style of someone who'd stopped softening conclusions about 15 years ago, contained one sentence that Isla read 3 times. In our assessment, the deferred maintenance patterns documented herein are consistent with the abrupt loss of a single highly skilled individual whose informal monitoring function was not recognized, documented, or transferred at the time of separation. She sent the full report to Landon with a message that said only, "As promised, take whatever time you need." He called her 2 hours later. "The fire suppression pressure in the East Wing," he said without preamble. "I flagged that 14 months ago. It's on page 41. "I saw it. The water flow rate to the sprinkler heads on floors 19 through 22 has been running at 73% of code minimum. If there's a fire on those floors, I know. It's on the immediate action list. The contractor is scheduled for Monday." A pause. "Who approved the contractor?" She almost smiled despite herself. "I ran the contractor credentials past 2 independent engineers first. Both cleared them." "Okay." Another pause, longer. She could hear, faintly, something in the background. The sound of a child's television program, a cartoon voice. He was home. It was a Friday afternoon. "The structural item on page 29, he said. "The parking structure column assessments. Those need to happen before any of the mechanical work. If the column integrity is compromised, you don't want heavy equipment moving through that space. I'll reorder the priority sequence. And page 55, the secondary generator fuel line. That's not rated critical by the firm, but it should be. The fitting type they identified is a known failure point under sustained load. Add it to the immediate list?" "Add it." She wrote it down. "Anything else?" 17 other things, he said, "but they can wait until I've read the whole document properly. Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "You read 63 pages in 2 hours." "I read the items I already knew to look for first, then the rest." He paused. "Is that the question?" "The question is whether you've made a decision." The cartoon sound in the background stopped. She heard a door close softly. He'd moved to another room. When he spoke again, his voice was in a different acoustic space, smaller, quieter. "I met with Marcus and the 2 other technicians yesterday," he said. "You knew I was doing that." "I knew." "They're carrying too much. Marcus has been flagging the same drainage issue in the sub-basement for 6 weeks, and it keeps getting deprioritized. The other 2 are splitting overnight emergency response between them because there's no rotation protocol anymore." He paused. "That's a morale problem and a safety problem. And they're connected." "I know. That's why I'm not finished." His voice was level, not cutting her off for the sake of it, just completing a thought. "I also spoke to Dolores. She's been consulting for 2 other companies since the layoff. She told me the thing she misses most about the Kensington building isn't the job. It's the people she'd learned to read over 11 years, who looked tired, who was having a bad week, who needed someone to notice." A pause. "That's not a facilities function, but it's related to what I'm trying to tell you." "Tell me." "The building works because the people in it work, and the people in it work because they feel like someone is paying attention, not just to the infrastructure, to them." He was quiet for a moment. "What you're asking me to do, the safety advisor position, I can do the technical part. I've been doing the technical part. But the thing that made it work, the reason it wasn't just maintenance, was that I knew the building the way you know a place you care about. Every person in it was a reason the work mattered." Another pause. "If I come back, I need to know that Framework doesn't change, that it's not just a department with a budget, that when I say something's wrong, the response isn't a cost-benefit analysis." "You have my word," she said. "I know that means something to you," he said. "I'm still working out how much it means in practice." She didn't take offense at that. It was the most honest thing he could have said. What would make it mean more in practice? He thought about it. Put it in writing, not a contract clause, just a document. What the function is for, what authority it carries, what happens when safety conflicts with cost. Something I can point to. "I'll have it drafted by Monday. I'll read it Tuesday." She waited. "Wednesday," he said. "I'll give you an answer Wednesday." He called Wednesday morning at 7:43, which was before Rosie's school drop-off, which meant he'd made the decision before that morning and had been waiting for a reasonable hour to call. Isla was already at her desk. "Yes," he said, "with the conditions we talked about. All of them. I'll start January 2nd. That gives me the rest of December to hand off some commitments at the community center and make sure Rosie understands the schedule change." A pause. "She'll want to know what the job is." "What are you going to tell her?" "That I'm going back to the building to make sure it's safe." He said it like it was that simple, because to him it was. "She'll accept that." "Does she know why you left?" "I told her the company was making changes and my job was part of them. She asked if the building would be okay without me, and I said I thought someone would take care of it." Another pause, something in it she couldn't quite read. She was not entirely satisfied with that answer. Smart kid. Insufferably so. Isla wrote the start date in her calendar. January 2nd. She looked at it for a moment. The specific fact of it. The small rectangle of a future day now containing something real. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I haven't started." The first 6 weeks were not easy, and Landon had not pretended they would be. The difficulty wasn't technical. That part came naturally, the way fluency in a language you've spoken for years comes back even after a gap. He moved through the building with the unhurried attentiveness that Marcus later described to a colleague as like watching someone read a room they wrote. He refamiliarized himself with every system, verified the contractor work from December, and began building a documentation structure that was better organized than anything the company had previously maintained. Not because he was told to, but because adequate documentation was the difference between a problem being caught and a problem being missed, and he'd spent years watching things fall through gaps that paperwork would have closed. The difficulty was organizational. Landon had been accurate about himself when he'd told Isla he wasn't good at organizations, and what he'd meant was that he had no tolerance for the particular form of institutional theater in which people performed the appearance of addressing a problem while ensuring the problem remained unaddressed because addressing it would require someone to admit they'd been wrong. He'd encountered this pattern everywhere, in the military and out of it, and his response to it had never evolved beyond a flat, direct refusal to participate. The first time it surfaced was in his third week, during a facilities and operations joint meeting that had been a standing Thursday institution at the Kensington Group for years, and had the well-worn quality of a ritual that everyone attended and nobody found fully useful. The operations director, a careful man named Holt, who'd been at the company for 11 years and had developed the institutional memory of someone who'd survived multiple regimes by making himself agreeable to each one, presented a deferred action summary on 6 items from the external audit. 4 of them had been rescheduled to Q2. 1 had been reclassified as lower priority. 1, the parking structure column assessments, had been moved to pending budget approval. Landon sat at the conference table and listened to the summary and then said, "The column assessments can't wait for budget approval." Holt looked at him with the expression of a man who understood that a direct statement in a meeting was a minor social breach. "We're looking at a significant spend. The CFO wants to see a full structural report first." The structural report is how you determine whether it's a significant spend or a critical spend. You can't defer the assessment to approve the budget for the assessment. That's backwards. It's the process. It's a process that produced 47 closed maintenance tickets over 3 years without independent verification. Landon said this without heat, just as a statement of fact. Around the table, several people found things to look at that were not either of the 2 men talking. Holt's jaw tightened slightly. "I understand the context, but we have procedures." "Landon!" Isla's voice came from the end of the table, where she'd been sitting with her hands folded and her expression neutral. Everyone turned. "What's your recommended timeline for the column assessments?" "Before anything heavy moves through that structure. The contractor for the fire suppression work in the East Wing needs vehicle access to the parking level. That's scheduled for February 9th. He looked at Holt without unfriendliness. "The assessment needs to happen before February 9th. Isla looked at Holt. "Move the column assessments to the immediate action list. Find the budget." Holt nodded, once, with the controlled expression of a man accepting a loss on a small field in order to understand the larger one. "Understood." After the meeting, in the hallway, Holt appeared at Landon's shoulder with the practiced timing of someone who'd learned to have the real conversation after the formal one was over. "I want you to know," Holt said, "that I'm not trying to create obstacles. The budget process is what it is." Landon looked at him. "I know. I'm not trying to make your job harder." A pause. "But some things can't wait for the budget cycle, and the column assessment is one of them. When you need to make the case to the CFO, I'll write you a technical summary that makes it clear what the risk is. That usually moves approvals faster than the standard request." Holt blinked. He'd apparently expected something different from this conversation. "That would be, yes, that would be helpful. Send me the CFO's format preferences. I'll have something by tomorrow." It was not a truce exactly. It was more like a working arrangement, two people who operated differently finding the functional overlap between their approaches. It happened in pieces over the following weeks, with Holt and with others, and it was rarely smooth, and Landon didn't pretend it was. San. What changed in the company during those early months was not the kind of change that appeared in a press release or showed up cleanly in a quarterly report. It was quieter and less linear than that, more like the way a room changes when someone opens a window. Not a dramatic transformation, just a different quality of air, a different relationship between inside and outside. The maintenance team was the first place it showed. Landon brought Marcus and the two remaining technicians, a woman named Yolanda, who'd been with the company 4 years, and a younger man named Terrence, who was 2 years in, into a Monday morning meeting that was not a formal meeting, just the 4 of them in the first floor facilities room with coffee and the audit results spread on the table. He didn't run the meeting the way managers ran meetings. He asked them what they saw. He asked them what they'd stopped bothering to flag because they'd learned nothing would happen. He asked them what they'd fixed on their own time because the ticket system had failed them. He listened to the answers without writing them down, which surprised them, and then he said, "Everything you just told me goes into a priority list that reports directly to Isla Kensington's office. Not through the facilities director, not through operations, directly." He paused. "When you flag something, it will be addressed. Not always immediately. Resources are what they are. But it will be acknowledged within 48 hours and acted on within a timeline I will personally fight for. If that stops being true, I need you to tell me." Yolanda, who had the particular wariness of someone who'd been promised things before, said, "What if the timeline you fight for still isn't fast enough?" Then I escalated again and I tell you what happened and why. I don't disappear with your problem and come back with an acceptable answer. You see the whole thing. He looked at her. That's the deal. It took weeks before they fully believed it, because belief in institutional promises was a thing you rebuilt slowly after it had been eroded. But it rebuilt. The broader employee population felt it differently, more gradually. Part of it was the physical reality of things being fixed. The loading dock door that had been sticking for months and had been submitted 3 times to the ticket system, suddenly repaired. The emergency lighting in the stairwell on floors 8 through 10, which had been intermittent for a year, replaced. Small things, accumulated, that added up to the message, someone is paying attention. The message landed differently now than it would have before November, because the story of Landon Pierce, in its circulated, imperfect, emotionally accurate version, had already done the work of explaining why it mattered. But the larger change, the one that mattered more than repaired doors and working lights, was what Isla was building alongside it. She'd started calling it the Foundation privately, before she had a name for it publicly, before she'd fully worked out what it was. It had begun as a conversation with her CFO about the reduction initiative, about what it had actually cost, not in the ways the cost-benefit analysis had measured, but in the ways it hadn't. The people who'd been cut weren't just headcount. They were institutional knowledge that had no line item in any budget. They were relationships that kept the informal infrastructure of the organization functional in ways that never appeared on an org chart. They were, some of them, people like Landon, whose contributions had been real and large and completely invisible to the metrics Isla had trusted. She'd gone back to the CFO twice more, and then to legal, and then to the board. Specifically to the board member who'd told her the job was about knowing what to optimize, who listened to what she was proposing with the expression of a man watching someone move the furniture in a room he'd arranged and deciding whether to object. He didn't object. She'd done the financial analysis well enough that objecting would have required him to argue against his own stated values, which he wasn't willing to do on record. The Kensington Employee Foundation was formally announced in February, 10 weeks after Landon's start date. Its structure was straightforward, a percentage of annual company profit directed into a fund that supported employees in crisis, medical hardship, housing emergencies, childcare gaps, educational assistance. Not charity in the transactional sense. The fund was administered by a committee that included both executive and frontline representatives, and the criteria for access were written to cover the real categories of difficulty that the HR department had quietly been tracking for years without any mechanism to address. The committee would also oversee a recognition program, not the performative kind with plaques in the lobby, but a quarterly review of contributions that hadn't been captured by standard performance metrics. The announcement happened in a company-wide meeting, not an email, because Isla had learned something about the difference between information delivered and communication that landed. She stood in the main conference room with every employee who could physically fit and the remainder watching on screens in satellite conference rooms, and she told the truth. That the company had made decisions in the name of efficiency that had treated people as variables and had been wrong to do so, and that what she was describing was not a program designed to undo what had been done, but to build something different going forward. She named no names. She made no reference to the storm or the truck or the cut above her eye, which had faded to almost nothing. But the room understood what she was describing. Afterward, in the small group conversations that followed in the corridor and the break room and the places where the real responses to company-wide meetings always lived, someone said to Marcus, "Does she mean it?" And Marcus, who had watched Landon Pierce fix things in that building for 6 years and had then watched Isla Kensington spend 3 months learning how to read the same building, said, "Yeah, I think she does." What nobody planned for because nobody could have was the February 9th incident. The fire suppression contractor had been running vehicle access through the parking structure as scheduled. Landon had confirmed the column assessment clean 2 weeks prior, which had come back with one remediation recommendation that had been completed before the contractor work began. The work was proceeding on schedule. On the third day, at approximately 2:15 p.m., a contractor worker noticed smoke coming from a utility corridor on the parking structure's lower level. Not a fire, not yet, but the particular smell and texture of smoke that meant something electrical was doing what it shouldn't. The contractor's protocol was to call the building emergency line. The building emergency line was answered, as it happened, by Landon, who was in the facilities room running a system diagnostic when the call came in. He was in the parking structure's lower-level utility corridor 4 minutes later. What he found was a junction box in the corridor's east wall that had not been on any inspection list because it wasn't technically part of the building's primary electrical system. It was a legacy installation from a renovation 11 years ago that had been partially decommissioned but not fully removed, and which still carried residual current from a secondary circuit that nobody had traced in years. The insulation on 2 of the remaining active lines had been compromised, probably by moisture intrusion over the winter, and they were arcing against the metal box casing. Not catastrophic yet. Moving toward it, he cut power to the secondary circuit from the subpanel in the corridor. Found it on the 3rd try, because the subpanel labeling was from the same 11-year-old renovation and bore only partial relationship to current reality, and confirmed the arcing had stopped, and then stood in the utility corridor for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that followed the passage of something that could have been much worse. The contractor workers had evacuated the parking level per protocol. No injuries, no fire. 20 minutes of disruption to a work schedule. He wrote the incident report himself that afternoon, with the same flat specificity he brought to all documentation, what had been found, what action had been taken, what the root cause was, what needed to happen next. He submitted it through the new safety reporting system he'd built, which routed automatically to Isla's office as a priority item. She read it at 4 p.m. and called him. "Are you okay?" she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which surprised her. "Fine." A pause. "It was a close thing, but fine." "The secondary circuit. That wouldn't have been on any standard inspection list." "No, it's from a 2013 renovation. The electrical drawings on file don't show it accurately. He paused. I'd been working through the legacy electrical documentation for the last 3 weeks. I hadn't gotten to that corridor yet. You were 3 weeks away from finding it anyway. Or someone else would have found it differently. He said it without self-flagellation, just as a statement of probability. The contractor worker who smelled it, his name is Danny Reyes. He's 22. He did exactly the right thing. I'll make a note to... I already spoke to his project manager and told him. Danny knows. A pause. He doesn't need it to come from the executive floor. He needs it to come from someone who was actually there. She sat with that for a moment. You're going to have to teach me that. Teach you what? The difference between recognition that lands and recognition that's for the person giving it. He was quiet for a second. That's a more self-aware question than you're giving yourself credit for. It was, she thought afterward, possibly the closest he'd come to a compliment in 4 months. She took it. March came, and with it a tentative warmth that the city treated with the cautious optimism of somewhere that had been fooled by early springs before. The Kensington building passed a follow-up safety inspection with 5 remaining items on a monitoring list, down from 31 in December. The foundation had processed its first 11 applications, approved 9, and the committee had held its first recognition review. Landon had been nominated for the recognition review by 4 separate employees, including Yolanda and Marcus and Dolores. Dolores, who had not returned to the company, but had apparently found out about the review program through Marcus, and had submitted a written account that Priya described to Isla as the most thorough character reference I've ever read in a professional context. Landon had declined the recognition when Isla brought it to him directly, which she'd expected, and she told him the committee would note his contribution in the record regardless, which she'd expected him to accept because he didn't fight things that didn't affect operational outcomes. And she was right. She'd learned to read him, in the way you learn to read a person when you paid consistent attention. She'd learned that he was more comfortable with honesty than with tact, that he valued consistency over enthusiasm, that he had a sense of humor that appeared rarely and without announcement and was dry enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. She'd learned that he carried things, not visibly, not in any way that asked to be accommodated, but the way a person who'd loved and lost and kept moving carried things, in the particular quality of his attention to other people's struggles, in the way he moved slightly faster when something needed doing than could be explained purely by professionalism, in the way he talked about Claire when he did, which was occasionally and always briefly, as something that had happened and had shaped everything and was not a wound he was asking anyone to be careful around. She'd also learned, more slowly because this one required more honesty with herself, that her own change was real and not a performance. The woman who'd approved a reduction list on a Thursday morning and moved to the next agenda item had not been pretending to be efficient. She'd been genuinely organized around a set of values that were incomplete, and the incompleteness had costs she hadn't seen because the costs had been borne by people she hadn't looked at. Looking had changed things, not fixed them. She was not under the illusion that the foundation solved what the reduction had broken, or that good documentation and better safety protocols undid the specific harm done to specific people. But looking had changed the direction she was moving in, and direction, maintained over time, was how things actually got built. The conversation happened in late March, on a Tuesday afternoon when the building was quiet and Landon had stopped by her office doorway. He rarely came to her office, she went to him more often, with a facilities update that could have been an email and both of them knew it. She set down her pen. Sit down, Landon. He sat in the chair across from her desk with the posture of someone who was comfortable with the furniture but hadn't quite decided about the room. How's Rosie? She said. Good. Better than good. She finished the flying dog story. It's 22 pages now. She started a second one. What's the second one about? A girl who can talk to buildings. He said it with the particular expressionless expression of a parent reporting something that was either coincidence or the clearest possible evidence of a child's observational intelligence. She says she got the idea herself. Isla laughed. He watched it happen, the way he sometimes did, with that almost warmth that lived in the neighborhood of a real smile without quite being one. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Are you okay? Not the building, not the foundation, not the team. You, personally. He looked at her. The question had slightly changed the air in the room, not uncomfortably, but perceptibly. Why are you asking? Because I've spent 5 months understanding what you were doing for other people, and I don't think anyone has asked you that in a while. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light through the office windows was the specific gold of late March, the kind of light that felt like a statement after a long winter, and it caught the edge of his face and the gray at his temples and the lines that were there from years of weather and work and things he'd been through that she didn't know all of. "I'm okay," he said. Then after a pause, "Better than I was in November. The job helps. Having somewhere to put the work." He stopped. "When I left the service, the hardest part wasn't adjusting to civilian life. It was losing the structure of knowing what you were protecting and why. The maintenance job gave me that back in a small way. This gives it back more directly." A pause. Rosie notices. She's been asking more questions about the building than she did before. "I think she's figured out what I actually do." "What does she think about it?" "She told me last week that I should make sure the elevators work because they're important." He said it with the dry delivery that meant he found it funny and was not going to elaborate on why. "She's not wrong. She's almost never wrong. It's exhausting." Isla looked at him across her desk. Outside, the city was doing what cities did in late March, finding its way back to itself after winter, the particular optimism of streets that had been cold for months beginning to ease. She thought about November, about the intersection in the rain and the 90 seconds she'd had with him before he disappeared into the dark. She thought about the gray shirt and the steady voice and the arm that had moved her out of the path of something that would have killed her. "I want to say something," she said, "and I don't want you to deflect it." He waited. "What you've done for this company, not just since January, but for 8 years before that, has protected people in ways they'll never know about. They rode the elevator and they walked through the building and they went home to their families, and none of them know that some of that is because of you." She held his gaze. "I know you don't want recognition for it. I know you'd tell me the work is its own purpose, but I want you to know that I see it. Specifically, clearly. Not as a metric I should have had or a framework I failed to build, as what it actually is, which is someone spending years of their life protecting strangers because they decided that was worth doing." She paused. "That matters. It matters in a way I don't have a better word for than matters." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was very still, in the way things were still when something was moving underneath them. "Claire used to say," he said quietly, "that I had a hard time receiving things, that I was good at giving and bad at the other direction." He stopped. She wasn't wrong either. "You don't have to receive it well," Isla said. "You just have to let it land." He nodded. Slowly, not the conclusive nod, something with more weight in it. He looked at the window. The March light was still doing its work on the afternoon. Somewhere in the building below them, the elevator ran its quiet route between floors, cable intact, tension roller properly maintained, carrying its daily 60 people home. "I know she'd have liked you," he said, not looking at her, still looking at the window, at the city, at something that wasn't in the room. "Claire. She liked people who were honest about their mistakes. She said it was the only interesting thing about anyone." A pause. "She had very specific standards." Isla let that sit. It was one of the things she'd learned to do. Let the significant things sit without rushing to meet them. "She sounds like she was a good person," she said. "She was a difficult person," he said. "In the best possible way." He paused. "Rosie's going to be the same. I can already tell." He stood, eventually. The facilities update, the reason he'd come, was delivered in 3 minutes, clean and organized, 2 items requiring her sign-off and 1 she could delegate. He took the signed approvals and folded them into his shirt pocket. The way she'd come to understand was simply how he carried paper. At the door he paused. "The recognition committee," he said. "The nominations from the first review, the ones from the employee floor. 3 of those people haven't been formally acknowledged by any manager in more than 2 years. Whatever the committee does with that information, it should be direct, not an email. Someone should go to them." "I'll go," she said. He looked at her, checked something in her expression, the way he did. "Okay," he said. He left, and Isla sat in the March afternoon with the light going gold and the city visible through the window and the specific weight of a day that had been ordinary in its surface and not ordinary underneath it. She thought about what she was building and what he was protecting, and whether those two things were becoming, slowly and imperfectly and without any of the smoothness she'd once believed was what success looked like, something that was actually worth what it cost. She picked up the pen she'd set down when he'd stopped in the doorway, and she went back to work.